Hello, I'm Carolyn Solomon, and I'm a professor of biology at Gallaudet University. I also serve as the director of the School of Science, Technology, Accessibility, Mathematics, and Public Health. I'm a trained biological oceanographer, so I often use geography in my own work. I'm thrilled to be here today. I'd like to talk about putting people with disabilities on the map. It's quite clear we have people with disabilities among us. Now, when we think about diversity, what typically comes to mind is race, gender, sex, sexual orientation, language, and others. But what's often missing from this is people with disabilities. For example, if you'll take a look at this definition of diversity provided by an organization, you'll see it states, in the social context, a successful community in which individuals of different race, ethnicity, religious beliefs, socioeconomic status, language, geographical origin, gender, and/or sexual orientation bring their different knowledge, background, experience, and interest for the benefit of the whole community. But what do you notice here? Where's the mention of people with disabilities? Disability is missing from that language. And disability is often overlooked. I'm a member of the Association for the Sciences of Limnology and Oceanography. That's the professional society to which I belong. I was asked to write a viewpoint for their bulletin. Of course, I was thrilled, more than happy to write a blog. And what I wrote about was being a deaf scientist and member of their organization. Now, one thing I'd like to mention about ASLO, they've been tremendously supportive of me as a scientist. There are, however, many things that still need to be worked on. One thing I really wanted to spotlight in this article is attitudes. The fear of having uncomfortable conversations. And I'll talk about that a bit more later on in this presentation. But what I want to point out here is that people with disabilities are starting to speak out now. Historically, we've been overlooked. However, the number of people with disabilities is actually greater than you may think. We are also diverse within the disability community. We have those who are blind, those who are deaf, little people, people who use wheelchairs, those who have varying physical disabilities, as well as some who have invisible disabilities. The disability community is truly all-encompassing. There are also a range of experiences, from those who have a disability from a very young age to those who develop a disability much later in life. Think about our own parents who may experience progressive hearing loss as they become older. People truly do experience disabilities across the lifespan in a variety of different ways, and I'm sure you know someone with a disability. It may be visible or invisible. Now is the time to bring people with disabilities into our space. But how do we navigate inclusion? I'd like to provide you with a roadmap. There are 4 general steps. First, listen to the stories people have to tell. Next, perform your own self-reflection. Think about what your own implicit and/or unconscious biases and attitudes may be. Once you've performed that self-reflection, you are then able to engage in difficult conversations. Those difficult conversations will lead you to becoming more proactive as opposed to reactive in your responses to people with disabilities. Now we'll talk about listening and watching stories. I'm intentionally saying listen with the sign placed next to my eye because I'm deaf and using a visual language to listen to these stories. I'm not listening orally, so I don't use the sign for this word placed next to my ear. People with disabilities will have a diverse range of ways in which they express themselves and receive information, and we need to be aware of this diversity. My talk, of course, primarily emphasizes deaf and hard of hearing people. However, I would like to say that there are other disability communities as well, and they have their own stories to tell. Here's an example of one such story. There's a great blog titled The Mind Hears, after a book written by Harlan Lane. In the book, Harlan describes the deaf experience. This blog reflects those experiences and spotlights those of deaf and hard of hearing academics. In this blog, there's also another great story of a graduate student studying frog calls in Brazil. She talks about how, regardless of her deafness, she can study these calls frogs make in different ways. The perception that it couldn't be done because she's deaf is inaccurate. Deaf can do these things. It's a really nice story, and she explains how she researches these frog calls. There are also very active groups on Facebook that are open to taking questions. One such group is FEED. It's named in this way because when you pronounce PhD, the movement on the mouth looks like FEED. Current graduate students often engage in discussion in this group, and one interesting topic came up just last week. A graduate student expressed frustrations they'd been experiencing in having conferences made accessible. We all know that conferences are important places to network, but accessibility is often a barrier. In fact, it's the greatest barrier for deaf academics, researchers, and scholars. This individual asked if anyone were willing to gather and strategize. Senior researchers in the field who have been doing this for 20, 30, or more years were able to advise these younger scientists on how to approach this. These are stories that need to be heard. Now, where can you find these stories? Well, you're all geographers, and I'm sure you have geographers with disabilities amongst you. I strongly encourage you to listen to their stories. They'll be highly informative on proceeding within your professional societies. Also, as I mentioned earlier, the blog The Mind Hears, with website information shown here, is a great resource. There are numerous Facebook groups, including those that focus on deaf and hard of hearing groups, but also many that focus on people with other disabilities as well. There are also some Twitter handles, including Disabled in STEM and Disabled in Higher Education. If you're on Twitter, you have the ability to read these diverse stories. I saw one story on Twitter about a geographer stating how great it would be to have a person with a disability leading a geographical organization. So yes, the stories are out there, you just need to find them. I'd like you to think about how we self-reflect in order to identify our own implicit and/or unconscious biases. In addition to that, what are your attitudes and typical responses to an individual with a disability? This is a great slide, spotlighting different types of common unconscious biases. For this, I would like to give credit to Bendita Cynthia Malakia from Hogan Levels. It shows 6 common biases. The first is likability bias. This is judgment against a woman based on how likable they are. For example, do they appear friendly? Are they smiling? Or other such ways to describe them. Next is attribution bias, which is when diverse people are given less credit than they deserve, or treated as though they're not worthy of their position or job. Performance bias is when we underestimate the performance of diverse individuals and overestimate the performance of non-diverse individuals. This includes requiring underrepresented groups to prove their worth, much more so than other groups. An example of this would be when I share my professional opinion on a topic, for example, say algae in a particular river. What I've noticed is that in a conversation, it is much more likely they'll take the comments of the hearing scientist over mine. They do so regardless of the fact that we have an equal amount of experience, skills, etc. That's a good example of performance bias. We also have affinity bias, which is when we feel connected to individuals like ourselves. As an example, let's suppose I'm holding interviews to hire for a position. If I have an Ivy League education, I'm much more likely to choose a candidate who does as well because we have that in common. Next, we have maternal bias. This is where parents are viewed as less competent and less able to handle their commitments as a result of taking care of their children. There's also intersectionality bias. This is when people with multiple identities experience multiple forms of discrimination. Let's say, for example, there's a Black woman from an inner city area. These are three different identities, each of which are faced with their own discrimination. Some people experience multiplicative discrimination because they have multiple identities. Thinking about why we react the way we do is important self-reflection. Think about your background or reasons you may be reacting in that way. Performing this self-reflection is crucial in helping us navigate these difficult conversations. There are many similarities in how we approach anti-racism and attitudes against people with disabilities, which we typically refer to as anti-ableism. People oftentimes like to remain fixed in their comfort zone. They may say things such as, I don't know where to start, or I don't know what to say. But if you've already gone through this process of self-reflection, you'll be armed with greater confidence and be ready to say things like, I'll listen, I'll read, I'll watch, I will speak against injustice. If your fixed comfort zone causes you to be fearful, you may think, I don't want to get something wrong, or to be called out. I'm not of that identity. I don't want to engage and make mistakes. But if you have that growth and courage mindset, you can accept that you will make mistakes. But you will engage in those uncomfortable conversations regardless and be grateful for the lesson. I often experience this. People are truly afraid to talk to me. They're afraid of being called out for potential misunderstandings. As a result, what frequently happens when I attend conferences is I spend my time alone with the interpreters. People are in their comfort zones, and it's easier for them to just not talk to me than it is to be assertive and try. All you need to do is come up, introduce yourself, and try different methods until you find what works. It could be using your phone, notes with pen and paper, anything to just initiate the conversation. Another fixed comfort zone attitude is that no matter what I do, it's not going to make a difference. Nothing's going to change. But if you have a growth courage mindset, you believe that things can only happen if you take the risk, that you'll become part of something bigger. For example, my doctoral advisor took a risk by accepting me as a student. I am confident she would tell you her growth as an individual, as a scientist, was significant. So much so that she came to truly understand what it means to be inclusive in the sciences. Another fixed comfort zone area is not wanting to be involved in politics, saying you don't have the time for it. But a growth encouraged mindset looks at this as a human rights issue and one that we must make the time and put in the effort for. This will lead us to taking a more proactive stance. As I mentioned earlier, intersectionality is the interconnection of multiple identities. We all have different identities. If you look at the person in the image, you can see them reflected in different colors: yellow, light green, dark green. These colors are representative of the various identities. For me, perhaps green is my deaf identity, red is my identity as a woman, yellow reflects my white identity, and the blue my identity as a scientist. Now, of course, what is seen as our strongest identity depends upon the person perceiving us. Oftentimes, what they see first is my deaf identity, when what I wish they would see first is my identity as a scientist. A good example of this was my experience attending a conference. I was in the midst of talking with someone when another individual approached me. They told me they'd seen the interpreter, they thought it was really cool, they were interested in the different signs for STEM terms. It was clear this individual saw me as deaf first. But when I'm at a scientific conference, my primary identity is as a scientist. I ignored their questions about the interpreter, the signs, the novelty of it all, and asked what research projects they were working on. I wanted to show them my primary identity in this context was scientist. I'm here at this conference as a scientist. Now, yes, of course, I do have a deaf identity, but in this particular context, I want to have a conversation as scientist to scientist. As you work through your own self-reflective process, one thing you'll notice is yourself becoming more proactive and less reactive. It's easier to adapt and accommodate when you already have the mindset that you need to prepare ahead of time, plan appropriately, and be more proactive and less reactive. An example of this would be to include funding in your conference planning process, to provide interpreters, or to provide captions for plenary talks. And eventually, it becomes part of your norm. Also, when you're hosting virtual conferences, such as this one, if you pre-record the videos, it becomes much easier to add captions. Your conference becomes fully accessible because you were proactive about it. This is much more preferable than receiving a request for accommodations from a deaf attendee, only to realize you have nothing in place, causing a panic. Again, if you have that proactive mindset, it becomes your norm. And we are now beginning to publish best practices in making our professional societies more inclusive. This paper was published last week in Frontiers in Education. It was authored by a group of deaf scientists who are all members of the Association for Research in Otolaryngology. They present 5 pillars for inclusion. They are fostering peer mentor groups, proactively providing equal access, as just mentioned, easing financial burdens, recruiting for leadership positions, which I can't emphasize enough. Having more people with disabilities in leadership positions means they're visible and already thinking about all these things. We need to elevate people with disabilities in leadership positions. And the final pillar is to establish a culture of equity and inclusion. This is a great paper for you to read. I've also published an opinion piece in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution, encouraging people to think about meeting frameworks to being more inclusive. The previous opinion piece in Nature had highlighted diversity, but again forgot to include disability. In our opinion piece, I, along with two other authors, encouraged readers to remember this and explained best practices in conference inclusion. Another point I'd like to discuss is featured here. The woman you see in the image talks about her experiences. As a graduate student more than 20 years ago, I experienced firsthand the frustrations of not being permitted on both small and large research vessels. I had to explain that simple adaptations were absolutely fine and that everyone on the boat would be safe. If that individual had just been comfortable enough to ask, and by comfortable I mean willing to step out of their comfort zone and engage in an uncomfortable conversation, we would have easily come to a resolution. To be perfectly honest, if I'm on a ship and I see everyone around me jumping overboard, I'm jumping too. It's common sense. So it's incredibly frustrating to hear from one of my own students, who is currently a graduate student at the University of Miami, that they're encountering the same barriers. Being told that they can't board the ship and that they're not permitted to take a motorboat licensing course. Really? Think about their biases. Why have they come to believe we're not capable? I can't believe 20 years have passed and the frustrations I experienced then are still taking place today. We truly need to reflect on this and ask ourselves why it is still occurring. Also, for your information, I serve on a committee for the National Academy of Sciences and will be offering a virtual conversation series on leading practices for improving accessibility and inclusion for people with disabilities. This includes those who work in the field, lab, or computational sciences. The first virtual presentation is set to take place December 16th, 2021. Please take a look at their website for more information, including Zoom links. This will be a series of 5 conversations. I'm very excited about these and hope you will join us there for an opportunity to learn more and from more people. Thank you.